I want to welcome you to Between Skepticism and Mysticism, an introduction to the occult philosophy of Cornelius Agrippa. This entire lecture series on the foundations of the occult philosophy is brought to you totally free of charge, completely open access by the incredibly generous folks that support my work over at my Patreon. This is all a bit of an experiment on providing free content through crowdsourcing education on topics that are just honestly rarely taught in universities at all. And when they are taught, a single class can cost thousands of dollars. If you'd like to support the production of university level open access education and topics in Western esotericism, I'd hope you consider taking a look at my Patreon, which you can join for as little as $54 a year. It's like buying me a cup of coffee or a beer once a month. But thank you so much for your consideration of supporting the channel and the work like this, and thanks to the patrons of this channel for making this lecture series possible. All right, everyone, welcome back to our ongoing summer seminar on the occult philosophy of Cornelius Agrippa. And I have to say that I'm beginning to get some degree of like occult fatigue of a certain kind. I feel like we're really like this material is getting extremely dense, and I will say that between this lecture and the one that follows it, we will have in some sense jumped the hurdle of the occult philosophy, at least for now. And again, I should remind people we're still only dealing with the material from roughly 1510. We have not even got into the material uh, that is subsequent to 1510, much less the eventual 1533 mature version of the three books of occult philosophy, which we, of course, will come back to in a bit of a differential way as we get into that later. But in a sense, what we've gotten to up to this point is we've described sort of the world outside of the human being, which is to say the terrestrial world to some degree and its various occult sympathies, and also the celestial world and that sort of the celestial powers raining down upon us, the astral powers. Then, of course, the divine world populated by angels and of course God there at the top of all this, who will come back to God briefly, some sense the main character of all this. But in another way, in an even more dramatic way, the human being is very much the main character in all of this. And as we mentioned last time, at the very center of the occult philosophy is Agrippa's anthropology, which is to say his theory of the human being and how the human being is, as Agrippa likes to remind us constantly, the knot of the universe. And this is a phrase he gets from Pico, and it is a phrase that he will repeat over and over again. Now, before we get into this, I just want to say that if we're now getting into sort of the more book three uh, uh, area, right? Remember, I said I'm not going to summarize the three books of occult philosophy, but we are now drifting increasingly into, at some level, some of the content at book three. And if you've been following along, you know we've been drifting back between books one, two, and three pretty constantly, because I think that again, part of how you have to tell this story is by showing how everything's connected. For Agrippa, it is a world of connectivity and a world of relationship, and we've been drifting back and forth through books one, two, and three. In a big way, we're going to be much more so in book three. And if you really want to pick out what I think is the most important book of book three, and insofar as book three is the summit of the occult philosophy, I would highly encourage folks to read chapter 36. Chapter 36 of book three is, in my opinion, the decisive chapter in all of it. And it is there that we get Agrippa's religious anthropology. And as I mentioned, part of what is going on in that religious anthropology is his theory of what the human being is and how the human being is uniquely special. And it is to that we turn today, which is to say, at the very fundamental core of it is the Hermetic principle that the human being is the nexus of the universe, which is to say, we have a terrestrial body that is joined with a celestial mind, and that is also dignified with a divine soul. And so the human being, much in the same way that the human being was for Plato, you'll remember back for your Plato, where the human being is in some sense the solution to the problem raised by Heraclitus and Parmenides. Are things constantly changing, or are they not? What's fundamentally real? Is the world of being fundamentally real? Is the world of becoming fundamentally real? And Plato sort of solves that problem as much as he solves that debate between Parmenides and Heraclitus by saying, yes, both and. That there is a world of being, And that world is unchanging, and that is a world in which we can have certain knowledge. And there's also a world of becoming, the physical world, which is constantly changing and is fundamentally irreal. And the human being is the nexus between the two, which is to say, we are both a body and a soul, and we are the bridge between the world of being and the world of becoming. That very similar idea, going all the way back from Plato, going into a kind of hermetic mode, but also being cashed out in terms of Agrippa's occult philosophy, is absolutely adopted in the three books of the occult philosophy. Again, the human being is the microcosm of the macrocosm. And another way of putting the whole task of the magus for Agrippa is the unification, the reunification of the macrocosm with the microcosm. And that is needs to be reunified because we've undergone a process of alienation. And that process of alienation is, of course, the fall of Adam and Eve. And we have to be reconciled to God. And in many ways, the reunion with the divine is in many ways, really not many ways, it is the purpose of the occult philosophy. Now, we'll come back to this more in a moment. Many people think the point of the occult philosophy is to get magical powers. Magical powers are simply a secondary, a derivative result of having one's soul reunited with the divine. Getting magical powers is an accident. It is not a necessary feature of things. It is something that one does acquire in the process of reunifying one's soul with God. But Agrippa, as we'll see, the point of all of this is that mystical reunion, and everything else is in some sense secondary to that, including the acquisition of magical powers. That idea, as we'll see, in fact, Agrippa will sometimes refer to the pinnacle of the occult philosophy as better than magic. And for folks who know their Valtahanograph will know that this is a really great article written by Valtahanograph about this topic. And Agrippa, as we'll see, is leaning very heavily here on Lodovico Lazzarelli and Lazzarelli's very particular understanding of Hermeticism. But at the core of all this, right, we are a terrestrial body, we are a celestial mind, and we are a divine soul. We are the nexus of the universe. In many ways, we are superior, to instance, for angels. Angels are simply divine beings of a certain kind. We are superior to them. We are superior to terrestrial creatures. And in many ways, we're also superior to celestial entities because none of them can fundamentally change their station. They are locked into the position in the cosmos in which they are. However, the human being, because of the kind of being that we are able to move in some sense up and down the chain of being in a way that virtually no other creature can. And because we were able to do that, we are unique in some sense in the ecology of entities that exist in Agrippa's world. So, how does this work? We've already gone through it a bit, right? That as we are exalted, as the our nature is dignified, as the human being is dignified, and are reunited, being reunited with the divine, that will make us masters of the terrestrial world. We'll come to gain knowledge of the occult sympathies that connect the terrestrial world. We will thus gain power over the terrestrial world because we will have gained that knowledge of the occult. We will also manage to escape the world of astral domination. We'll talk more about how we can escape the world of astral domination via the influence of the celestial objects and the sort of the causative power those celestial objects can have upon us. And finally, of course, the reuniting of us with the divine is in some sense our birthright, because again we were created in the image of the divine, and therefore it is because like is bound to like. Being reunited with God is our destiny in some sense because we are in some sense God. Now, Agrippa's going to have to be very careful about the way he talks about that, but as we'll see, Agrippa does often talk about the idea that in some sense the divine aspect of us needs to be returned to the divine, and we'll talk about in what sense what aspect of us is in fact divine here in just a moment. Why do we have to do all this? Well, because the fall. We experience a metaphysical alienation from the divine via the problem of sin, and that has especially clouded our mind. Agrippa really is very attentive to the idea that particularly the problem begins in our mind. And again, when you hear the word mind here, please think of this in the medieval or Renaissance thinking of the mind, where the mind and the soul, the anima, are fundamentally united in some kind of way. So I know that many of us, especially for those of us with a more scientific bent, are thinking about the mind via the brain, or the mind as an emergent property of the brain. That is not the way Agrippa is thinking about it. He's thinking of the anima, the thing that we are, the mind, as being fundamentally attached to our soul, as we'll see in just a minute. And that mechanism has become clouded, particularly has become clouded in that we are driven either by base instinct, terrestrial base instinct, or we are driven by reason, which we've talked about at length. Agrippa's deep distrust of reason and how he thinks reason fundamentally is not going to reunite us with the divine, and his numerous critiques of scholasticism, which is a mechanism by which we can come to learn truths about the divine via reason. This is all for Agrippa complete nonsense. And so he is skeptical of of reason as a mechanism by which we can do that. And of course, right at the core of all of this are the mechanisms of the mechanics of magic, and those are all bound up with the kind of entity that we are. That is to say, the magic that operates at the terrestrial level is linked to our body, at the celestial level is linked to our anima, to our mind, and of course, the magic that operates at the divine level, as we'll see, is directly tied to our soul. So let's get into the mechanism or the structure of how it is that our mind works according to Agrippa, and again how our anima works. This is a really lovely medieval image of a depiction of how the de anima, Aristotle's vision of how the mind worked. I've always loved this depiction. It's just kind of crazy looking, but that is I can find you a higher resolution image if you want to see it. But basically, it is a schematized version of how Aristotle's De Anima allegedly describes the human mind. Now, to be clear, Agrippa is not going to follow Aristotle, at least in everything, but as we'll come to it, he does follow Aristotle quite closely in some ways. So let's begin with the highest register of our mind. This is linked to our soul. Agrippa will typically refer to this as the mens, and it'll sometimes refer to it as the intellectus. So the intellect. Now, again, intellect is not, he's not using an intellect in the way that we use it, but the mens or the intellectus is the part of us that is directly connected to the divine, and it is that aspect of us that is in fact divine. So that is a piece of God. You, inside of you, is a fragment of the divine, and that is directly linked to the divine. I always imagine somehow like a silver cord attached to the top of my head, reaching all the way as a tendril all the way back to God. In many senses, the entire purpose of the intellect or the mens is to be illuminated. So I think, and again, Agrippa's not quite clear about this, but it seems like the mens is either illuminated or it is not, which is to say, it is a kind of it is something of a binary state. Either is it illuminated or it is not, and in some sense, it will survive. Well, not in some sense, it will necessarily survive your death. Because the divine can never die, for obvious reasons, it will immediately return back to God once you physically die. So this is again, I think of it a bit like a rubber band or something. God has stretched out God's being. You are an extension of God, and once you die, that rubber band snaps back into the divine. So that part of you will go back to God. Now, the question here is, to what degree is Agrippa engaging in what is referred to as Averroism? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but an ever-present anxiety in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance is that insofar as there is a part of you that is necessarily divine and will go back to the divine, and it is impersonal, it is simply a region of the divine that you happen to be inhabiting, there is always the worry of what is called Averroism. And the worry of Averroism is that you will not uniquely have an afterlife. There is not a unique afterlife for you. And this has all kinds of anxiety in the Middle Ages, because the worry is, if there is not a unique afterlife to you, if you do not have an individuated soul, then you can't, for instance, be tormented after your death for having done all the bad stuff, and you can't be rewarded for having done all the good stuff. And insofar as there is no individualized punishment and reward, this seems to deeply undercut the possibility of ethics. Now, Agrippa knows that he sounds a bit like an Averroist, and if you read through the 3 books of occult philosophy carefully, he will say, "I am not an Averroist." He's like, "I know that you think that I'm guilty of this, but I'm not." Now, him saying he's not doesn't actually make him not one, but there is a worry here. And Agrippa knows it and he names it. Now, to what degree he is able to discharge that claim, I don't know. But I think that he is flirting with a bit of a verism here. All right. Beneath the mens is the ratio. So again, I'm not going to translate these because, your reason, that's not a good translation because Agrippa doesn't like reason. So he does not reason in the sense of the rational mind, but it is in some sense the next lowest down aspect of your mind, of your soul. This is a part of us that is individual to us. And in some sense, this is the fallen aspect of our mind. The mens or the intellect is always exalted, and whether it's illuminated or not is a different question, but it is always connected to the divine. Our individualized ratio is capable, for instance, of error, and it is capable of being subjected to fate. Now, what can happen is that the ratio can be informed by an illuminated intellect. So if your intellect becomes illuminated, your ratio can turn in some sense toward that illumination and be guided by that illumination. If the ratio is guided by that state of illumination, it can escape error, and it can manage to escape fate. It can be freed from the powers of fate. However, if the ratio does not turn toward illumination and does not seek illumination and is not guided by illumination, at the moment of death, the ratio will not survive death. It will stay here in Earth, on the Earth level. And depending on what you've done, it can become something like a ghost. So this is Agrippa's explanation for ghosts. Ghosts are people that did not follow their illuminated intellect, the illuminated mens, and turned rather to lower levels that we'll talk about of the soul, and their ratio simply became trapped here, and it can become a ghost. That's also the part of you that gets punished in hell. The ratio is a part of you that will eventually go to hell after the last judgment. It can be subject to punishment. It is also the part of you that is individualized, that when you do go to heaven, if you have been properly illuminated and you have been saved in the way that it is important for a good Christian to be saved, this is the part of you that will personally go into heaven, and it is the individuated sense of self. This is how Agrippa thinks he avoids the charge of Averism, because the ratio, if it is illuminated, is individuated and does proceed on to heaven. And if it is not illuminated and it follows, for instance, the idolum, which we'll talk about in just a moment, it can roam around as a ghost, or it can be tormented by demons in hell forever, which sounds like a real cheery thing to happen to people. Beneath the ratio are two other faculties. And it seems like Agrippa believes there are many other faculties, but he doesn't really talk about those other faculties. But below that are the imaginative faculty. So this is a place we'll talk about in just a moment. Agrippa is very interesting in that he demotes the imaginative faculty in a way that is untypical of most medieval magic. And also, of course, the cognitive center of the cognitive faculty, the part of you that does the thinking. Now, you're probably wondering, why in the world would Agrippa demote imagination and demote cognition? Cognition should be relatively obvious. Agrippa doesn't think highly of cognition. He does not think highly of reason. And therefore, this is the part of you basically that does all your thinking. And Agrippa basically thinks that thinking itself is a symptom of a problem. The fact that we have to think at all discursively is, for Agrippa, proof of the fact that we're fallen. God does not think discursively. God simply exists in a constant state of thought. And rather, for us, it's like a train of thought. And if you've ever had, I don't know, intrusive thoughts, or just sort of like you're trying to go to sleep and your brain's keeping you awake for no reason, that moment where like you're having like a panic attack because you're trying to think about going to sleep, and thinking about going to sleep is making you not go to sleep. Those are the kind of like insanity stuff that we all deal with. And that kind of cognition is, for Agrippa, proof of the fact that we are fallen, right? Because we wouldn't think in this discursive way if we had a sufficiently illuminated intellect. For Agrippa, real cognition, and I'm using the term loosely here, if you've ever had that moment, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example of this. If you've ever had that moment where you're playing chess and all of a sudden you like see the right move, or like you've ever had the eureka moment where you're like, that's it.
or like you've lost something, and all of a sudden you just like you instantly know where it is, or you see like you kind of immediately you have an immediate apprehension of a problem. I don't know if you've ever like solved a math problem. You looked at a math problem and you like instantly know the solution. That moment of instantaneous knowledge, that's, I think, for Agrippa, quite close to what a God thinks like. God doesn't have to ask God's self questions about where did I leave my keys. God always knows where God's keys are. God doesn't have to think about what's the answer to Sudoku, right? God immediately knows the answer to all the Sudokus. If you ever immediately seen the solution to a problem, just like thump, instead of like a flash of light, that is for Agrippa what he thinks of as sort of pure ratio knowing, as opposed to cognition, which is like a train of discursive thoughts that might be all jumbled and bizarre and wrong. Further, right, in the idolum is also the imagination. This is also very interesting because for my folks who know a little bit more about medieval magic and medieval theories of mind, imagination is incredibly important in many medieval forms of magic, precisely because for medieval people, pre-Cartesians, imagination is not only the part of your mind that generates images. When you sort of want to generate the image of I don't know, a unicorn, you generate the image of a horse and a horn, you stick them together, and now you've generated with your imagination the image of a unicorn. That is the way we typically use the term imagination now, and that is because we're all under the influence of Descartes. Now, medieval people also thought that's what the imagination did, but medieval people also thought the imagination was an organ of perception as well. The imagination, or the fantasiae sometimes, is also how you could aspects of the world around you that were invisible to you. So imagine that if there were things going on around you that you couldn't see, for instance, the angels and demons roaming around, you cannot see them via your eyes because angels and demons simply don't exist in that way. Rather, they exist as spiritual entities. And so, what are you seeing when you see a demon or an angel? You are seeing the angel or the demon use their powers to directly imprint upon the organ of your ability to generate images. They imprint upon that organ representations of themselves. So you're not looking at an angel when the angel shows up and says, "Be not afraid." You're not seeing the angel with your eyes. Rather, your imagination is being manipulated directly by the angel to generate an image that you're seeing in front of you. So the imagination for medieval people was just as much an organ of perception as it was a mechanism by which you would generate made up things like unicorns or the dog headed people or whatever medieval people generated in their imaginations. Agrippa also demotes the imagination down to a significant degree. And again, for folks who know something like a good example, like the Ars Notae, the Ars Notoria, that is an entire form of magic deeply embedded with the use of imagination, and contemplating those notai is driven by the imaginative organ. Agrippa, again, thinks of the imagination as in general not trustworthy because he in general thinks of it as mostly generating false imagery. And so he has a very low impression of the imagination, I would say very much unlike almost every other previous theory of magic. At any rate, the idolum, right? Again, this part of us that does both imagination and cognition, these are definitely subject to fate. They're absolutely subject to celestial forces, and because they are subject to to fate, those are the elements of us that are that the celestial rays can affect, and this part of you dies at death. So it's important to think about your ratio as the middle point. It is you. It is the you that is able to make decisions. And the question is, are you going to be driven by illumination, in which you will persist your death and go into the realm of the blessed? Or, even better, in life, you can achieve the state of felicitas, which we'll talk about shortly. So you can go in that direction. The ratio can turn in the direction of illumination, and that is the ability. That's the direction you want to go. But you could also take the ratio, and you can be informed primarily by the odolum. This is informed primarily by imagination and cognition, and ultimately, this dooms you. This will doom you. You will not ultimately survive your death. You will become a kind of ghost or whatever. but you will not be able to survive your death in any strong sense of the term. And finally, of course, we're bodies. We're bodies. And bodies, of course, are terrestrial objects. They are made of earth, air, fire, and water, and they are completely subject to fate. So, is there a day out there that you're going to die? Yeah. Has to some degree that been fated? Probably. How do you escape that? You escape that by turning inward. This will sound a bit like Stoicism. You turn inward, and as you turn inward, the part of you that is really you, the ratio, as it is illuminated by the intellect, that part of you is not subjected to fate. So, what is the task of the mage for Agrippa? The task of the mage and the task of magic is to allow the illuminated intellect, the illuminated mens, to instruct ratio, right? To instruct the part of us that is the ratio. And when it instructs that ratio, it becomes expressed through our imagination. We perceive through our imagination, and we act in the world via cognition. All the while, we are embodied, which is to say, we are physically in our body. But despite being embodied, and despite having to rely on imagination and cognition, we gain access to a higher order form of reasoning. Once the microcosm and the macrocosm are reunited, we gain access to a higher form of reasoning, and that higher form of reasoning is directly influenced by the illumination. And of course, we also gain higher faculties of control over reality, because again, what do we acquire? We acquire magic. And as we acquire magia, that gives us control over, for instance, the terrestrial world. It gives us some degree of control over the celestial world, and eventually to allow us to go back into the higher realms. That moment of dignification, where we have reunited the macrocosm with the microcosm, when we have reunited the human being with the divine, that circuit, when it's completed, is what Agrippa will refer to as the state of felicitas, of felicity. And this is the goal of the occult philosophy. It is to achieve the state of felicity. We'll talk more about what felicity is in just a minute, but that is the goal. We have not introduced this term felicitas yet, but we will get to it in more detail later. But that is the goal. Now, why is it that felicitas is not much more discussed in Agrippa? This is one of the greatest things in the three books of occult philosophy. If you read book 36, Agrippa will tell you, here's the goal. It's to get to this condition called felicitas, which is union with the divine, and I'm not going to say anything else about it. In fact, we're not going to talk about it publicly. Moving on, here's how you do some fumigations. Here's how you do some religious ceremonies. Here's how you do it. Here's how you get to it. But what it is in itself, Agrippa is going to say, I can't tell you. It's a secret. Now, he's kind of pulling our leg a little bit, because he's not telling us because there's nothing to be told about it. And that'll become more obvious in a moment. Felicitas is a state in which no knowledge of that state is possible, and no language to describe it is possible. And there's no knowing about it. There is experiencing it, but there is no knowing about it. And so in this way, as we'll see, and this is a point that Dan Atrell and I were talking about sort of behind the scenes a couple of days ago, in many ways, Agrippa is an anti-Gnostic. Is an anti-Gnostic. For the Gnostics, knowing things is salvific. For Agrippa, knowing specifically the structure of the world and the nature of the demiurge for the Gnostics, for Agrippa, the highest point of reunion with the divine is inherently not about knowledge. It is anti-Gnostic. You can know nothing about it, and no knowledge about it is gained, for reasons that we'll talk about that have to do with the nature of the divine in just a moment. Now, in addition to that model of the human being, Agrippa also mentions this weird Neoplatonic thing that he kind of sneaks in and never really talks about. And this is sometimes referred to as the ethereal spiritual vehicle. Now, for my Neoplatonists in the room, will immediately recognize this as having its origins in Plotinus, but really being systematized primarily by Proclus. Agrippa he mentions it, so we should mention it, but let me say a little bit about what it is. So it's in Latin called the Ethereum animi vehiculum. Agrippa uses it, and to be clear, what the function that it has in Neoplatonism is this is the it's hard to describe. It is the vehicle. It is like a spiritual car that your soul rides in when it returns back to the realm of the divine. It is the capsule that basically carries your soul into the world of the divine. Now, part of what's important about that, right, is it shepherds it back to the world of the divine, but also shepherds it back. And it is the vehicle, again, by which transmigration happens. So this is at the core of Neoplatonism. It is very important for the theory of metempsychosis, the theory of reincarnation. Now, Agrippa is not going to believe in reincarnation. He rejects reincarnation. He explicitly says that metempsychosis is not good, right? But what he does think is that this vehicle is the mechanism by which God did transport your soul into your body. So if you've ever wondered how the soul got into your body, this is Agrippa's use of this Neoplatonic idea to describe it. So basically, what ends up happening is the vehicle travels down from the divine. It sort of is the thing pulling the soul out of God. I always imagine like a bit of like dough, like God is like a ball of dough, and you're like pulling out part of it, right? So that part of it being pulled out is driven by the vehicle. It enters into your body at some point, I guess when you're a baby, and maybe in utero. It enters into the heart, and from the heart, it radiates out to be coterminous with the body. So it irradiates out from the heart, and it carries the mens. It carries the intellect. So that is the part that diffuses through your body and diffuses the intellect through your body. And when the body dies, it is also the thing that reattaches. And again, I imagine sort of coming out of your chest. I always have this image of like the fire in the sky where like the aliens like shine the bright light on him. And he like throws back and he's like lifted up. But at any rate, when you die, this is a part of you that travels back out of the body. I guess it kind of sucks it back into a central point, I suppose. It pulls it back into a central point, and it carries the mens back to the divine. However, if your intellect, if your ratio rather, has been illuminated, it will also drag your ratio with it. So it is the mechanism by which the mens or the intellect comes from the divine, diffuses into your body, and when you die, it is the mechanism that can also take your ratio back into the realm of the blessed, and it seems to be the mechanism by which the illumination occurs. So it is the connective tissue between you and God, and when God turns the light on, so to speak, I imagine a bit like a piece of fiber optic cable, right? When you have a piece of fiber optic cable and the light's on, it's like all the fiber optic cables light up. Well, you're kind of connected to God via fiber optic cable, the AAV, and when God lights it up, well, that's your illumination. Now, exactly what this is, Agrippa never tells us. It's made of something. It is not. It's made of some kind of ethereal substance. Agrippa knows that it's associated with metempsychosis. He says that it does not remigrate. It does not remigrate. But again, I think anyone who is reading this in the 16th century would have, if they read their Neoplatonism, would immediately think about this uh, in terms of um, in terms of metempsychosis. But furthermore, it is also the connective tissue. The AAV is also sort of what ethereally connects you to the rest of the occult world, the world of the sympathies and stuff. It is also the when you do magic, so to speak, when does magic, it originates inside of the ratio and then flows out through the AAV, and it flows out into the world, and that is a part of you that is interacting with the occult forces or the occult powers in the world for Agrippa. So it is like what makes transitive magic happen. If you've ever wondered, like where exactly does the magic originate inside your body, so to speak, and then where does it interact with the outside world? Well, the answer is again, the world is pervaded with this spiritus business, and the spiritus, right, is the part of you that connects ultimately to the AAV, and the spiritus is the vehicle or the medium through which transitive magic occurs. So this is all again, we could if I were a better illustrator, I could illustrate this for you. but it is all, again, part of the various connective tissues that connect us to the divine, that connect your soul to your body, and that connect all the parts of your soul to the various other parts. But it is also the part of you that is connected via the spiritus to the rest of the magical terrestrial and celestial worlds. Your spiritus also can flow through various parts of your. It can also flow through various parts of your body. And Agrippa uses the example of the evil eye. So, for instance, if you do magic via the evil eye, spiritus literally flows up through the magical forces inside your body. It flows out of your eyes, and it can do all kinds of evil stuff via your eyes. So, again, we don't see any of this because it's a cult. That's why it's a cult philosophy. But this is the vehicle or the medium through which occult causation occurs. Now, exactly to what degree does the vehicle and the rest of the soul interact? We don't know. Agrippa never tells us, but that is in a rough way his sketch of how it all works together. Now, we turn finally to the issue of illumination, which is kind of at the heart of the entire thing. It is the mechanism that sort of kickstarts the empire in the entire process. Illumination seems to have its origins in the divine realm. When God said, "Let there be light," at the very beginning, Yehi Or, and God said, "Let there be light," not only did God illuminate the world with light that separated light from darkness, but also illumination is the mechanism by which anything is intelligible at all. So one way of thinking about this, and again, if you're thinking of Plato here, when Plato gives the analogy of the sun, that's exactly what Agrippa is relying on. In the same way that the sun generates light that allows us to see things around us, God also illuminates the world in such a way as to make it intelligible at all. God renders the world intelligible in God's infinite mercy, and that intelligibility of the world is the sort of primary act of illumination. Now, the world does not strike us as terribly intelligible because it all seems kind of chaotic and weird. That's because we have a fallen mind. But that illumination begins in the divine, it cascades down to the world of the celestial. It cascades from the divine, it cascades down to the world of the angels, then it cascades down to the world of the celestial powers until eventually it cascades down to here at the perhaps at the terrestrial level. Agrippa seems to indicate that the terrestrial world is illuminated, but does not do any illuminating. Just to be clear, right? The celestial world can illuminate the terrestrial world, the divine can illuminate the angelic can illuminate the celestial, and the celestial can illuminate our world, but not the other way up. The terrestrial world doesn't do any illuminating. So, when we think about this moment of illumination that occurs again within this very particular part of our intellect, it has three registers. There is the highest register, which is the divine illumination. There is a lower register, the angelic illumination, and there is a lower register still, the celestial illumination. And what ends up happening is that one seems to climb up the chain of being. It's not clear that you can skip steps. I think, in fact, one cannot skip steps, it seems, that you have to go up the ladder in some sense. But the idea is that if the illuminated intellect rightly guides one's ratio, the conscious part of one's mind, the originator of that illumination sort of gives as an act of grace or as a gift the powers of those illuminations to the person who is illuminated. I'll make that say that maybe in a different way to make it a bit more clear, or give an example perhaps. Let's say that you are celestially illuminated by Venus. If you are celestially illuminated by Venus, you will gain Venusian powers. Right? You will gain Venusian powers. If you are celestially illuminated by Mars, you will gain martial powers. If you're celestially illuminated by Raphael, you will gain Raphael-like powers. I assume this would be the ability to do healing, perhaps. So, in the same way that a talisman can gain power via celestial, uh, absorbing celestial energy, in some sense, the talisman is being illuminated, right, by that energy. Well, the same thing can happen to you. You can you can uh, focus or channel. The language is difficult to get here, but one can bind oneself. That's the language, actually. One can bind oneself to a specific object of illumination and gain the powers of that having been illuminated. Again, Mars, you'll get martial powers. I imagine you would want to be illuminated by Mars if you're going into battle or something like that. So, when you bind yourself to the object of illumination, whether it's an angel, ultimately it should be God, but whether it's an angel or whether it is a celestial object, that binding is typically referred to by Agrippa as legatio, right? To be bound, right? To be bound. So this legatio binds you to that. And when you are bound, when your intellect is bound to that celestial object, you gain those metaphysical powers. You gain those magical powers. So this ligation, this legatio, this binding that one gets, that is a mechanism by which one achieves magic. Right? Now, terrestrial magic, of course, doesn't require any illumination. It just requires you to uncover the occult forces that are all around you and then instrumentalize those to your will. You don't need any illumination to pull that off. But if you are specifically illuminated by an angel, you'll gain those kinds of powers as well. And you can imagine some angels are more powerful than others. And Agrippa, again, believes in the 9 orders of angels. There are some that are very low. You know, some rando angel is not going to be terribly powerful. But I imagine if you get illuminated by Michael, whose name, Michael, means the one like God, I imagine you get some pretty badass powers. I don't know what they are, but I've seen pictures of Michael beating up demons and stuff, and I imagine you can, I don't know, you have magical demon beating powers or something. I don't know. But this is the point, right, where you try to get these illuminations at these various levels. So, just as a human being is the knot of the cosmos, right? They can also have the power at those various tiers between those different systems of sympathies. So again, if you are binding some occult object over there, right, you can get powers via those objects because you, in some sense, are absorbing those powers into your soul via the system of sympathies. So I know this all sounds like a very crazy Final Fantasy game mechanic. Like this is like Final Fantasy 78 or something, like with espers and all kinds of things. You have to charge an esper and do it. This needs to just be a game mechanic. That needs to someone just needs to take Agrippa's occult philosophy and basically make it into like Dungeons and Dragons game mechanic because it's ready made for it. But at any rate, this is where the power actually comes from, folks. It comes from this process of legatio, right, by which you bind yourself to these objects, and it literally the object, the power of a various of I don't know Saturn or something. Saturn's probably not a very good one to do it, although Agrippa does say a lot about melancholic illumination. We'll talk about in just a minute, but you can kind of literally like uh, have those Venusian powers or whatever Jovian powers poured into you when you're illuminated sufficiently, you gain those powers via those angels or via those celestial powers. Now, this again, this is why you need to know a lot about angels in the Agrippan system. And if you've ever seen those long lists of Hebrew names, like the ones I have on the slide now, he has them in Hebrew every single time. Why? Because you need to know them in Hebrew because the Hebrew names are ontologically more powerful, as we talked about last week, and you need to know what they do, right? It's not enough to just call on Raphael. If you don't know what Raphael is doing, and you're just hailing Raphael to come illuminate you, and you don't know that Raphael is an angel associated with healing, well, Raphael's not going to listen to you because you're just calling Raphael, and Raphael's like, why is this guy blowing up my phone and he's not even trying to heal somebody? If you want to get powers, I don't know, say you want to like again, you want martial power and get victory over the I don't know the Saracens or something. Raphael's not going to pick the horn up because it has nothing. He has nothing to do with military combat. He's like, you need to call someone else. And so, if you don't understand the nature of the angels, if you don't understand their names, literally their Hebrew names, which indicate to you what they're good at, you're just going to be bothering a bunch of angels by blowing their phone up, and it's going to irritate them more than anything else. So this is the reason why you have to know all this stuff, because for Agrippa, you need to know in some sense it's like a switchboard, like an old-fashioned switchboard. You need to know who you're getting in touch with and for what reasons. Otherwise, they're not going to pick the horn up because you're just bothering them. And furthermore, as we talked about last time, all of this goes through the conduit of the area, the region between the earth and the moon, and that entire region is populated by demons. And if you're not wise, if you don't really know what you're doing, and you could be calling all kinds of entities using all kinds of sigils, it's going to perk up the ears of demonic beings, and those are going to show up, and you're not going to know the difference. And so we talked about this last time. This requires a lot of discernment. And so this is not the kind of thing where, on your first day as a mage, you're trying to call down the powers of Michael. Probably not a good idea. That's probably not a good idea. Now, and we're gonna, we'll introduce this time, and we'll have to turn to the fiores next time. Because the intellect is directly connected to the divine, and one might even say that the intellect is divine, because it's directly connected to the divine or is divine, and because spiritus is connected to the world spirit, if you line things up correctly, you gain a kind of God's eye view of the universe, of the cosmos. And as you can imagine, if you have a God's eye view of the universe, you will see time the same way that we see space. I see space, and the way we experience space is that things are further or closer to me in space, but they all exist at the same time. They all exist at the same time. So I look at that thing, I look at that thing, that one's further away than that one, but they both coexist in time that's the same relation. Well, from a God's eye point of view, God sees time the way that we see space. Some things might be in the future and some things might be in the past, but they all exist at the same moment of time. God sees time as if God sort of goes outside the chain of causation and looks down at it, and it's all happening in the eternal present, because God is eternal and God is therefore at the eternal present at every point in time. God is just as the past to God is just as real as the future. God could change the future, God can change the present, and God could change the past. God doesn't change the past too much because of God's grace. But time is, time is a flat circle for God, right? You might think of the God as being like a 5D entity, that we have 3 dimensions of space, one of time, right? And from God's point of view, it's all the same. God sees all space and all time at the same eternal moment. Well, if your soul is properly illuminated by the divine, you will gain that vantage point. Now, you won't hold on to it for very long, because illumination is not a thing that lasts forever. But in that moment, you will see time the way that God does. And insofar as you see time the way that God does, you will be able to do something very cool. You'll be able to know the future, just the same way that God knows the future. God knows what's about to happen. And because you get illuminated via this mens ratio business, you will have the ability to see the future. And of course, this is a pretty powerful ability. It is the ability of prophecy. For Agrippa, this is how prophecy works. It is a result of illumination. It is a secondary result of illumination. Now, for many of you, you're going to immediately recognize this as being very similar to Maimonides' idea of prophecy. For Maimonides, one can gain access via one's intellect to the active intellect, to the agent intellect, and that's God's presence in the world. And that gives, for Maimonides, how he thinks that that prophecy works. Agrippa and Maimonides are very, very, very similar in this way. Very similar in this way. However, what Agrippa does, and what Maimonides would never have done, is that this this kind of illumination is going to have several different forms. The first form it's going to have is astrology. Because the astral beings are slightly closer to God, right, than we are, they are in some sense ahead of the curve. And in fact, God and God's grace has actually cooled the celestial objects to give us some sense of what the future is going to bring. Now, it doesn't determine it, but it's sort of like God being like, hey, look, like, this is about to happen. Like, get ready for it. In the same way that, for instance, you can see a storm in the distance, dark clouds in the distance, and you can basically know that rain's coming. In the same way that being able to look at the distance and see the rain coming, God has programmed the cosmos such that you can kind of see what's coming via the astrological weather. And so this is tied into astrology as well. So that's sort of the first level of prophetic inspiration. If you want to begin the process of beginning prophetic inspiration, go do astrology, because that's the closest unilluminated version of being able to do that that one has access to. The other ones, which we'll talk about, of course, next time it seems, are very specific forms of celestial illumination. Very specific forms of celestial illumination. So one can sort of read the stars and kind of learn what's going on in the future, but one can also become illuminated by the stars. And in those moments of illumination, you get various kinds of boons. We'll talk about those more next week. But this is where Agrippa is going to turn toward three distinct forms of celestial illumination. There's going to be the frenzies, the furores, or the mania. You'll recognize those from Plato's Phaedrus. If you've read Plato's Phaedrus, you'll know about the various kinds of mania or furores, the furors. This is where you get inspiration from celestial objects, and those celestial objects will give you access to certain kinds of hidden or secret knowledge. You can also have the experience of ecstasy or rapture. This is where you go out of your body and you interact, for instance, with angelic beings, because you cannot interact with them in this body typically, but the aspects of you that can leave your body can go interact with those angelic beings directly. So these are ecstasies or raptures. If you've ever seen images of saints in raptures and ecstasies, those, the ecstasy of Saint Teresa being the most famous, she is no longer in her body in some sense for Agrippa. The part of her that is her, the part of her consciousness, is now in communion with a non physical consciousness. And those ecstasies and raptures are very powerful. Those are going to be, as we'll see, a precursor to divine illumination, which will be the goal of all this, remember. And finally, I don't know, the crappiest form of illumination that one can get are dreams. Dreams, Agrippa thinks, are quite murky and quite unreliable, but dreams do contain, or very often contain, information emerging from the occult world, or from the world of the celestials, or from the world of the angels, or perhaps from the world of the demons as well. And dreams are also a mechanism by which your consciousness is able to interact, mostly passively, but it's able to interact with the world of the of occult causation, and it can interact with other kinds of entities as well. So, just to get a sense of where we're going for next week, the main thing we're going to be dealing with next week is the first rung of the illumination, which is to say celestial illumination and angelic illumination. Those are going to take the form of the frenzies, and they're going to take the form of raptures. So we'll look at next week. We'll look at the frenzies and the raptures. We'll also look at dreams, which Agrippa has he thinks that there are important things to be said about dreams, although he thinks they're not reliable. And after we've gotten the celestial illuminations in terms of the form of the frenzies, in the form of the ecstasies and raptures that are typically associated with angelic illumination, and finally with dreams, which can be very mixed, we will turn ultimately to the most important form of illumination, divine illumination. And it is divine illumination, which is directly the instrument of God. God illuminates as God sees fit, and it is in that moment of a divine illumination where we can experience what Agrippa calls felicitas, felicity. And it is in that moment of felicity that the barrier between God and the human being dissolves. And just as a drop of water can fall back into the ocean, the soul that you are can, while you are alive, very importantly, while you are alive, your soul can briefly return to the divine. And in the experience of returning to the divine, because the experience of the divine is a coincidence of opposites, insofar as the divine is a coincidence of opposites, that will mean that there is no language to describe it, because it is both X and not X at the same time. And because it is this completely beyond language event, there is no knowledge to be gained from it. It is non-noetic, and it is non-gnostic. So what comes back from that experience? You come back from that experience having experienced felicity, knowing that there is the experience of felicity. There's nothing to be known in the experience, but because you have experienced it, you can now tool ever more your ratio to the moment of illumination. And as you train your ratio toward the moment of illumination, you begin to gain further and further and further power. And as those illuminations mount up, you gain more felicity, more moments of felicity, and you, of course, gain all the attendant powers that come along with your having gone up the chain of being, controlling the terrestrial world, controlling at some level, having gotten some control over or instrumental control over the celestial world, and then directly in the communion of the presence of various kinds of angels at various levels. As you can imagine, once you've climbed up that entire arc, one imagines that you have godlike powers. The Agrippa, I think, imagined you as basically having godlike powers because you've climbed all the way to the very top of the ladder of being. You've directly been illuminated by the divine. Your soul has returned to the divine, and having experienced that, you'll have gained all kinds of powers. Now, finally, I'll say this before we wrap up for today: the goal is felicity. Magic is both the means and the byproduct. Magic is a means and a byproduct. What Agrippa is very clear about in book 3, if you read it carefully, is that magic, insofar as you think of magic as the end of the project, you're probably being driven by the adolum. You're probably being driven by lesser things. If you want to get power and you're power hungry and you just want to get control over the terrestrial world and that's all you want, you can do it. Agrippa thinks you can do it. But ultimately, if you're driven by that kind of power, that desire just to control things or instrumentalize things, you're being driven by a base version of yourself. And Agrippa ultimately thinks, yeah, you're going to die and be a ghost. You might be an evil magical ghost, but you're just going to be a ghost. You're going to be a shell of your former self. That is not the goal of the system. Magic is a byproduct. It is a means by which the goal of the system is to get illuminated and return to the divine and be reunited with the divine, to experience felicity in this life. That's the goal. The magic is a byproduct. And I think Agrippa, again, even though he's very committed to the idea that magic is in fact transitive, that one does gain power over the world, focusing on getting that power is actually an impediment to kind of upgrading yourself. Because by focusing on getting that power, you're not really focusing on what the goal of the system is, which is ultimately felicity, which we'll talk about next time. And Agrippa thinks that you can get caught up in that. And as you can imagine, I mean, I imagine all of us have gotten a little taste of power. We've gotten a little bit of taste of power, and the first thing we do is abuse it. And Agrippa thinks that the moment you begin thinking about using the powers that you obtain merely for instrumental ends, merely to get stuff, Agrippa ultimately thinks at that level you'll basically be trapped, and you'll be trapped in such a way that you will not survive your death and you will not experience felicity in this lifetime. So it is interesting to me and unfortunate that many people come to the 3 books of occult philosophy looking to get magical powers. And Agrippa, what I think, would tell them, if you're going to the 3 books of occult philosophy merely to get magical powers, you're missing the point of the book. The point of the book is to lead you to reunion with the divine. Now, along the way, you do get magical powers, but by focusing on those powers as if they're the end and not the means, you doom yourself. And so it's incredibly important to understand that that is the goal. Felicity is the goal. And when we come back next week, we will spend a lot more time talking about the fiores, about ecstasy and rapture, and about dreams, and of course, about the state of felicity, and understanding as much as we can what the state of felicity is. But like I said, Agrippa is going to tell us, very much infused by Nicholas of Cusa, that because God is a coincidence of opposites, there is nothing to be gained knowledge-wise from the experience of felicity, and that I mean, all you can say is it exists. And beyond that, one is simply left in completely reverent silence. And it's in that divine silence, that divine not knowing, that divine agnosis, that is the moment where you achieve felicity, to achieve that state. And it's from that state that one has to return and live in this world. But it is felicity that is the goal of the occult philosophy, not magic. And Agrippa will say this, that it is felicity that is better than magic. And if you want to read an excellent article about this, Walter Hanegraaff has a fantastic article called Better Than Magic, in which he lays this out very clearly. And not only that, but he shows very clearly that Agrippa is leaning on the distinctively Christian Hermeticism of Lodovico Lazzarelli. I'll have an episode about Lodovico Lazzarelli. And in many ways, the chief goal of the system is that Lazzarellian silence, that ecstatic silence where one is caught in the rapture of the coincidence of opposites. One is bathed in the divine light and not light, the divine light and the divine darkness at the same time. And in that moment of felicity, that is what one wants to achieve. And as we'll see, Agrippa believes that it happens all at once. It's sort of a samadhi like experience. It's like being hit over the head with God. And that is the point of the whole thing. So we'll come back next week and we will finally, I think, wrap on this section on the occult philosophy. Although, of course, we will not wrap talking about the occult philosophy more generally, because if you may be shocked to believe me, but after Agrippa composes all of this as a 23-year-old in 1510, he continues to improve upon it. And we'll see that he continues to improve upon it after 1510, especially during the Italian period. And we're going to see how he improves upon it or doesn't, depending on what you believe, and how ultimately he's going to lean in the direction of a radical skepticism, not because the skepticism is about not knowing. It's a skepticism, however, is in the interest of mysticism. It is a mystical skepticism. And unsurprising, you're right, if the experience of felicity is fundamentally non-noetic, then one could I think conceivably argue that because the experience of felicity is non-noetic, then there is nothing to be learned from it. And a kind of mystical skepticism is going to be right in the order that we see in the tradition of people like Nicholas of Cusa, of people like Augustine. Agrippa is going to, I think, be very much in that tradition, although in an incredibly radical way. So we will turn to the frenzies, the ecstasies, dreams, and ultimately felicity